Apex is a 2026 survival action thriller that was released exclusively on Netflix on April 24, 2026. The film is directed by Baltasar Kormákur, the same man who gave us Everest and Adrift, two films that already proved he knows exactly how to put human beings in impossible situations and force the audience to feel every second of it. This time around, he takes that same raw energy and channels it into something even more personal, more psychological, and more relentless. The film is written by Jeremy Robbins and produced by a powerful team that includes Ian Bryce, Peter Chernin, Jenno Topping, David Reddy, and the lead actress herself, Charlize Theron, alongside Beth Kono and AJ Dix. Kormákur also served as a producer through his own company, RVK Studios, while Chernin Entertainment handled the broader production side. Netflix secured the rights to this project back in February 2024, and what followed was a carefully assembled production that would eventually take cast and crew across some of the most extreme environments on the planet. The film runs for 95 minutes, carries an R rating for strong violence, grisly images, nudity, and language, and is a Netflix original, meaning you can only watch it on the platform. It is available to stream worldwide. The countries involved in the production are the United States, the United Kingdom, and Iceland, and the cinematography was handled by Lawrence Scher, with editing by Sigurdur Eithorsen and music composed by Hogni Egilson. The visual effects were supervised by Enric Pavdeja, with major contributions from Framestore, ILM, Rising Sun Pictures, Union VFX, and Host VFX. This was not a small production. Every department was working at a high level to bring this world to life. At its core, Apex is about one thing: survival. Not just physical survival, but emotional survival. It is a film that asks what a human being is truly made of when everything is stripped away, and the only thing standing between them and death is their own will to live. Director Kormákur said in interviews that he wanted to use action, horror, and hardship to reveal character, and that has always been the driving force behind his filmmaking. With Apex, he pushed that idea further than he ever had before. Where it was made and who made it. The film is set in a fictional place called Wandara National Park in Australia, but the actual filming took place in New South Wales, Australia, specifically in and around the Blue Mountains. Principal photography began in Sydney in February 2025 and then expanded outward into increasingly remote and demanding locations. What started as a production originally planned to be set in Yosemite was relocated entirely due to logistical constraints and environmental protection laws. That forced relocation turned out to be a creative turning point. Kormákur leaned fully into the Australian environment, and what he found there was something far more cinematic and far more extreme than anything Yosemite could have offered. The production was genuinely punishing. Sequences were filmed inside deep caves that could only be reached by helicopter drops. Cast and crew were required to swim into certain set locations. At one point, the team was reduced to around 40 people in wetsuits navigating freezing underground water to capture a single sequence. Kormákur himself said that every single day was a challenge for the crew. The film also shot briefly in Norway to capture the opening mountain climbing sequences on the Troll Wall, which adds a completely different visual texture to the first act before the story moves into the heart of Australia. The combination of those two extreme environments gives Apex a visual scale that is genuinely impressive and rare for a Netflix release. Baltasar Kormákur is an Icelandic filmmaker with a long track record of survival-oriented projects. He knows how to use location not just as a setting but as a storytelling tool, and in Apex, the Australian wilderness becomes as much of an antagonist as any human character in the film. He has spoken about how the rivers, the caves, the cliffs, and the waterfalls were all woven directly into the narrative, each one serving the story rather than just decorating it. Plot details. The story begins in Norway. Sasha, played by Charlize Theron, is an adrenaline junkie and world-class rock climber. She and her Australian boyfriend Tommy, played by Eric Bana, are scaling the troll wall when a sudden storm rolls in. Tommy tells her that his lucky compass is warning him that their luck may have run out, and they decide to rappel back down the mountain. But before they can make it to safety, an avalanche sends a rock crashing into Tommy's head, knocking him unconscious. His dead weight begins to pull Sasha down with him, and in a moment of desperate survival instinct, she is forced to release his rope. Tommy falls to his death. That moment, and the guilt that follows it, becomes the emotional engine of everything that comes after. 5 months later, a grieving Sasha drives alone toward the fictional Wandara National Park in Australia. She is carrying that guilt with her. She is not just looking for adventure. She is looking for something harder to name. A park ranger warns her about a string of recent disappearances in the region, but Sasha presses on anyway. She is drawn to danger in the same way she always has been, except now there is a darkness underneath it. She sets up camp and begins navigating the wilderness on her own, kayaking through rivers, moving through forests, and trying to outrun the grief that has followed her across the world. What she does not know is that she has already been noticed. Ben, played by Taron Egerton, is a deeply disturbed and highly skilled hunter who has been using the remote wilderness of the national park as his personal hunting ground. He is not a loud or theatrical villain. He is quiet, methodical, and almost clinical in the way he operates, which makes him considerably more unsettling than an aggressive antagonist would be. He gives Sasha a head start, and then begins to follow her through the landscape, hunting her the way a predator stalks prey. The film then becomes a relentless chase through the Australian outback. Sasha has no gun and no outside help. She has her climbing skills, her endurance, and her survival instincts. Ben is everywhere, and the wilderness itself is working against her at every turn. But as the film develops, something shifts. The psychological weight of what Sasha is carrying begins to be addressed rather than buried, and Kormákur himself described her journey as a kind of self-inflicted reckoning. The guilt she has been carrying since Tommy's death is not separate from her survival. It is connected to it. When she finally comes to terms with what happened on that mountain in Norway, she finds something in herself that Ben did not account for. The film's midpoint takes a darker and more disturbing turn when the story reveals that Ben is not simply a hunter with a warped hobby. He is a practitioner of far more sinister rituals. The reveal that his first kill was his own mother, and that he consumes those he considers worthy prey as a way of keeping their spirits alive within him transforms the film from a survival thriller into something with genuine horror underneath it. It is brutal, it is strange, and it is the kind of detail that sticks with you long after the credits roll. The ending sees Sasha fighting her way to freedom. Without giving away the precise mechanics of the finale, the film delivers on the promise it makes from the very beginning: she has to win. And the way she wins is connected entirely to who she has become over the course of her ordeal in the wilderness, not just as a survivor but as someone who has finally confronted the thing she has been running from. Kormákur designed the conclusion to feel earned rather than convenient, and both the performances and the landscape work together to make that landing hit hard. Cast: Charlize Theron plays Sasha, the film's central character. Theron is a South African-American actress and Academy Award winner, best known for roles in Monster, Mad Max, Fury Road, Atomic Blonde, and The Old Guard. For Apex, she went through an intensive training process specifically focused on rock climbing, which was an entirely new physical discipline for her. She has spoken about how different it was from the martial arts training she had done for previous action roles, saying it felt less technical and more instinctive, and that there was a real risk to it that no one could fully choreograph for her. She performed a significant amount of her own stunts throughout the film, including the whitewater kayaking sequences and portions of the troll wall climb. Theron has called Apex her favorite film she has ever made, which is a remarkable statement from someone with her body of work. Taron Egerton plays Ben, the film's villain. Egerton is a Welsh actor who became widely known through the Kingsman franchise, as well as standout performances in Eddie the Eagle, Rocketman, and Carry On. Apex represents a dramatic pivot for him. Egerton described the role as the most disturbed character he has ever played, and said the extremity of it was exactly what attracted him to the project. His director Baltasar Kormákur compared the experience of seeing Egerton in this role for the first time to seeing Jack Nicholson in The Shining, saying that the novelty of it is part of what makes it so disturbing and effective. Charlize Theron herself called Egerton one of the best actors she has ever worked with, saying he has an incredible gut instinct that you cannot teach, and that some of the most iconic moments in the film came entirely from choices he made on the day. The performance has been widely praised as one of the most unexpected villain turns of 2026. Eric Bana plays Tommy, Sasha's late partner, whose death in the opening sequence provides the emotional foundation for everything that follows. Bana is an Australian actor with a long and accomplished career, known for films like Munich, Troy, Black Hawk Down, and Hulk. His role in Apex is relatively contained to the opening act and to flashback sequences throughout the film, but he brings a grounded physicality and emotional weight to the character that gives Sasha's grief genuine texture and makes the audience feel the loss alongside her. Having an Australian actor play the Australian character and work in his home country's landscape added an additional layer of authenticity to the role. The supporting cast includes Caitlin Stacey, Aaron Peterson as a park ranger, Matt Whalen as a woodsman navigating the terrain, and Bessie Holland as a local cashier who witnesses elements of the unfolding events. These characters ground the film in realism and give the isolated world of the national park a sense of actual community and human presence outside the central conflict. Release date and trailer info. Apex was released exclusively on Netflix on April 24, 2026. Netflix made the film available worldwide simultaneously, going live at midnight. The film debuted at number 1 on Netflix's global charts and held that position for multiple consecutive weeks following its release, making it one of the platform's most successful original films of the year. The first trailer for Apex was released in early 2026 and immediately generated a significant amount of attention online. A second official trailer was added on March 29, 2026, expanding on the footage and giving audiences a clearer look at both the scale of the action and the psychological tension between the two lead characters. The trailers made excellent use of the Australian landscape, showcasing the kayaking sequences, the cliff faces, the cave systems, and the dense forest terrain that defines so much of the film's visual identity. They were carefully cut to reveal enough to create excitement without spoiling any of the film's more significant reveals. At the time of writing, Apex holds a 70% score on Rotten Tomatoes from critics, with the audience score sitting slightly higher at 75%. Most critics who praised the film pointed to the two lead performances and the masterful use of location as the film's greatest strengths. Some critics felt the survival genre formula was familiar, but even those reviews acknowledged the quality of the execution. Thomas Lafley of RogerEbert.com gave the film 3 out of 4 stars, noting that Kormákur is masterly in using his locations, marrying every river, cave, rapid, and waterfall with the narrative. Egerton's work in particular has been singled out as one of the more unexpected and genuinely unsettling villain performances of the year. There are currently no confirmed plans for a sequel, but the combination of the film's massive streaming success, Charlize Theron's evident passion for the project, and her existing relationship with Netflix through the Old Guard franchise means that a follow-up is far from out of the question. The complete story of Apex 2026. The story of Apex begins not in Australia, but on a freezing vertical cliff face in Norway. Sasha, a world-class rock climber and lifelong adrenaline junkie, is sleeping inside a portaledge, which is a small suspended tent attached to the side of a sheer mountain wall, high above the ground. She wakes up and begins her morning the way she always does, with absolute focus and no fear of the terrifying drop beneath her. Beside her in that hanging tent is her partner Tommy, an Australian man she loves deeply, a man who has spent years matching her appetite for extreme adventure. The two of them are tackling the Troll Wall in Norway, one of the most challenging and dangerous climbing routes in the world. As they prepare to continue their ascent, Tommy brings up something that has clearly been sitting with him for a while. He tells Sasha that he is ready to stop. Not just the climb, but the lifestyle. He wants to settle down. He references his lucky compass, a small object he carries everywhere, and says with quiet seriousness that he feels like their luck might be running out. Sasha does not take this well. She is not a person built for slowing down, and the idea of stepping away from the kind of life they have built together does not sit easily with her. But she loves him, and when a storm begins to roll in and conditions on the wall begin to deteriorate, she agrees to turn back. They begin to rappel down the mountain. Then everything falls apart in a single terrible moment. An avalanche dislodges a large rock from above, and it comes crashing down the mountain face, striking Tommy directly in the head. The blow knocks him unconscious immediately. He goes limp and hangs suspended from the rope, his dead weight beginning to drag Sasha down with him. She fights to hold on. She tries to find a way to hold both of them, but the weight is too much, the ice is cracking beneath her, and the storm is howling around her. In the most horrifying and pivotal moment of her life, Sasha makes the only decision she believes she can make. She releases Tommy's rope. He falls. She watches him go. And just like that, the person she loved most in the world is gone, and the rope she is holding is suddenly slack in her hands. That moment defines everything that follows. It is not just grief that Sasha carries out of Norway. It is guilt. A particular kind of guilt that lives in the body, that replays without warning, that does not respond to logic or time or reassurance. She was the one who cut the rope. She was the one who chose to live. And even though no reasonable person could fault her for that choice, she faults herself every single day. 5 months pass. She does not get better. She does not move on. She simply carries it. When we meet Sasha again, she is driving alone through Australia. She is headed toward the fictional Wandara National Park, a vast and remote stretch of wilderness in New South Wales. She does not tell anyone exactly where she is going. She is not looking for company. She is not looking for healing in any conventional sense. She is looking for the wilderness, for something that will demand everything from her, something that will fill the silence that Tommy left behind. She has his compass with her. She keeps it close, as though proximity to that small object might somehow keep some part of him nearby. Before she enters the park, she stops at a ranger station. The ranger on duty warns her about a string of recent disappearances in the region. There have been missing persons reports. People have gone into the park and simply not come back. The warning board at the station is covered in faces of people who have never been found. Sasha looks at those faces. She registers the warning. And then she drives into the park anyway, because that is exactly the kind of person she is. The danger is almost part of the draw. She sets up camp alone in the wilderness and begins navigating the landscape by kayak and on foot. The Australian outback that surrounds her is staggeringly beautiful and deeply hostile at the same time. Rivers cut through red rock canyons. Dense forest presses in from every side. The caves go deep underground, accessible only if you know the water well enough to swim through them. It is a place that rewards knowledge and punishes carelessness, and Sasha, for all her grief, is skilled enough to move through it with confidence. She paddles the rivers. She scouts the terrain. She is grieving, yes, but she is also, for perhaps the first time in 5 months, feeling something close to alive. It is during this early period in the park that she has her first encounter with Ben. At first glance, he is a local outdoorsman. He is physically imposing, quiet in his manner, and seems to carry himself with the ease of someone who knows the wilderness intimately. He approaches Sasha in what appears to be a friendly way and offers her some advice on the terrain. He even offers her jerky. She accepts. They talk briefly. He recommends a particular route, a more difficult one, telling her it offers the best scenery in the whole area. Sasha, being exactly the kind of person who always chooses the harder path, takes his suggestion and heads that way. What she does not know yet is that Ben has been watching her for a while already. He noticed her earlier, in a local general store, when a group of hostile men tried to intimidate her. She handled them with quiet precision, retreating when she needed to and holding her ground when she had to, never panicking, never losing control. Ben watched all of this with something far beyond casual interest. He saw in Sasha exactly the kind of person he has spent years looking for. She is not easy. She is not predictable. She is a real challenge, and for Ben, finding a real challenge is the entire point of what he does. Because Ben is not simply a man who lives in the bush. He is a hunter of human beings. He has been using Wandara National Park as his private killing ground for a long time. The missing persons on that board at the ranger station are all his victims. Every single one of those faces belongs to someone he hunted and killed in this wilderness. He is patient, methodical, and extraordinarily skilled in outdoor survival. He does not panic. He does not rush. He has done this many times before, and he has a system. He gives his targets a head start. He lets them think they might escape. And then he hunts them down with a crossbow, taking his time, enjoying every minute of the chase. That night, after Sasha has set up her solo camp and settled in for the night, Ben makes his move. He goes through her campsite while she is sleeping and removes her equipment. He takes what he needs and leaves her deliberately compromised, stripped of tools she will need if she is going to survive what is coming. When Sasha wakes and realizes what has happened, the situation shifts completely. She understands with chilling clarity that the friendly man from earlier is not friendly at all. Ben makes his intentions explicit soon after. He produces a stereo and his crossbow, and in a moment that is as unsettling as it is darkly theatrical, he tells Sasha the rules. She has until the end of the song playing on the stereo to get as far away from him as she possibly can. When the song ends, he starts hunting. That is the deal. That is the only deal. Sasha takes off running. What follows is one of the most relentless and physically punishing chase sequences in recent Netflix history. Sasha throws herself into the landscape, using every skill she has accumulated over a lifetime of extreme adventure. She escapes on her kayak and paddles hard through the river, trying to put as much water as possible between herself and Ben. She loses the kayak and continues on foot, running along the riverbank, scrambling through dense vegetation, using the terrain the same way a climber uses a rock face, reading it constantly, looking for the next hold, the next advantage. She is moving fast, moving smart, and for a while it seems like she might actually have a chance. Ben is never far behind. He is not frantic. He does not run wildly or shout after her. He moves through the wilderness with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this many times before, someone who knows the land better than she does, someone who has all the time in the world. At one point, Sasha hears voices nearby. She follows the sound, hoping desperately that there are other people in the park, that she might find help, that she might be able to signal someone. She moves toward the voices and discovers that it is a recording. Ben has planted his phone in the bush with a video playing, a family talking normally, enough to draw her toward a specific location. The trap works. She has moved exactly where he wanted her to go. Ben opens fire with his crossbow. The bolts come flying and Sasha throws herself sideways, twisting through the undergrowth and the river, using the water and the rock faces as cover. She is hit. One bolt grazes her thigh, not a lethal wound, but enough to make every subsequent movement agonizing. She falls back into the river, injured and disoriented, but still thinking, still calculating. She manages to reach a ravine and haul herself upward along the rock face, using her climbing instincts to get herself to a position of relative safety. From up high, she spots something below. A canoe, tied to the shore. If she can get to that canoe, she can get on the water, and on the water she has a chance. She descends carefully and approaches the canoe, reaching for the rope holding it in place. The moment her foot hits the ground beside it, a bear trap snaps shut around her foot. The pain is immediate and enormous. She cannot move. She cannot get the trap off. The sound of the trap closing has already alerted Ben, and he comes back through the undergrowth with total composure. Sasha fights back using pepper spray she has managed to keep on her, blasting it directly into his face. The spray burns badly, but Ben absorbs the pain and forces through it, regaining control of the situation despite his eyes streaming. He points the crossbow at her and removes her from the trap, but instead of killing her, he ties her up. He is not ready to end the hunt yet. He has something else in mind. Ben takes a bound and injured Sasha deep into the wilderness, leading her to a cave that is accessible only by going through underground water. What Sasha sees inside that cave shocks her to her core. Hanging from the walls and the ceiling of the cave are the remains of human beings. Processed, preserved, and stored with terrifying efficiency. The missing persons from the ranger station board, the people whose faces she saw and dismissed on her way into the park, they are all here. All of them are his victims. Ben has been hunting people in this wilderness for years, and he has brought all of them to this cave. He has built himself a private charnel house deep beneath the Blue Mountains. And then it gets worse. Ben begins to talk. He is not a man who explains himself in long speeches, but in the claustrophobic intimacy of that cave, certain things come out. He reveals that he is not simply someone who kills for sport. He practices a deeply disturbed set of rituals around what he calls consuming the worthy. He believes that by consuming those he hunts, he keeps their spirits alive within him. He reveals, in the most chilling moment of the film, that his first victim was his own mother. He loved her, in whatever broken way he is capable of love, and so he turned her into jerky to keep her close to him forever. The jerky he offered Sasha when they first met, that casual act of hospitality at their initial encounter, was made from the remains of a previous victim. Everything about that first meeting was constructed from death. Ben intends to do the same to Sasha. He tells her as much. She is worthy. She is special. In his twisted psychology, this is the highest compliment he knows how to give. Sasha has no interest in his compliments. The moment she has any opportunity at all, she takes it. She bites Ben's ear clean off, using the sudden shock and pain to break free from the shackles he has put on her. She runs. She gets back to the river and throws herself into the current, letting the water carry her away from the cave and away from him. Ben is right behind her. The river carries them both over a steep drop. The fall knocks Ben unconscious. Sasha hits the water hard but stays conscious, and she uses those precious seconds while he is out to try to break the bonds still holding her. She cannot get fully free before he wakes up. He regains consciousness and comes after her with everything he has left, overpowering her physically in the water, getting his hands on her again, pulling her under, trying to end it right there in the river. Sasha fights back with every ounce of strength she has remaining. She gets herself above him, gets the leverage she needs, and brings a rock down on his leg with enough force to fracture it completely. The sound is sickening. Ben collapses. Now both of them are broken and exhausted, still bound together by the cable Ben used to tie them when they went over the drop. Ben cannot walk on his shattered leg. Sasha is injured and barefoot, her shoes having been taken by Ben back in the cave. They lie on the riverbank through the night, completely spent, and Sasha does something she has not fully allowed herself to do in 5 months. She talks about Tommy. She tells the darkness, and perhaps tells Ben, who is lying beside her, about the guilt she has been carrying since Norway. About the rope she released. About the choice she made to live when her living meant Tommy dying. She has been holding that inside since the moment it happened, and here in the most extreme and stripped-down moment of her life, it comes out. When morning arrives, the logic of their situation becomes clear. Ben cannot survive without Sasha's help. His leg is fractured badly, and the wound is already beginning to attract insects. Without movement, without getting out of that remote location, he will die slowly of infection and exposure. He knows it. Sasha knows it. They reach a brutal and wary agreement. Sasha will help Ben climb a nearby cliff face so they can get out of the canyon. He cannot do it alone. In exchange, he promises to unshackle her when they reach the top. Sasha fashions a prusik knot from what she has available, a simple but effective climbing technique that will allow her to help pull his weight up alongside her as she climbs. They begin the ascent together, Ben harnessed against her, both of them hauling themselves up the cliff face one hold at a time. It is agonizing and slow, and neither of them trusts the other for a single second of it. But they climb. Halfway up the wall, at a wide ledge, Sasha pauses. She has been working at her harness throughout the climb without making it obvious, subtly loosening the connections, preparing for what she knows she has to do. Ben notices. He realizes what she is doing and makes a violent attempt to pull her off the wall, grabbing at her and trying to drag her down with him. But the harness is already loose. It slips off her cleanly. She is now free of the connection between them. Ben, still harnessed and suddenly off balance, clings to the knot that Sasha fashioned, the one holding him against the wall. Sasha reaches out and removes that knot. Ben falls. He goes down the cliff face with a look of pure horror on his face, and he hits the bottom, and he does not get up. The apex predator, the man who has hunted and killed at least 20 people in these mountains, dies the way every one of his victims died. Surprised. Falling. With no agency over what is happening to him. Sasha is now alone on the cliff face, no harness, no shoes, nothing but her bare hands and feet and 40 years of climbing experience. She free solos the rest of the wall. There is a moment near the top where she almost slips, where the exhaustion and the injuries and the sheer accumulation of everything she has been through nearly takes her off the rock. She holds on. She breathes. And then she climbs the rest of the way and pulls herself over the top. She walks through the forest in the dark. Barefoot, injured, and completely alone. She eventually comes across a car, and the people inside are kind enough to help her, driving her back toward the park entrance. She makes her way to the ranger station where she first saw those missing persons posters, the faces she registered and dismissed, and she tells the ranger everything. She tells them where the cave is. She tells them about Ben. She tells them what is inside. A helicopter is dispatched. When it reaches the cave, it recovers the remains of 20 human beings. 20 victims from the missing persons files, all of them found in Ben's underground killing ground. The news reports that follow make clear to the public that the string of disappearances in Wandara National Park was not caused by the wilderness. It was caused by one man, and that man is now dead. The families of those 20 people finally have answers. They finally have something to bury. They finally have the possibility of closure, which is the one thing that grief most desperately needs and so rarely gets. The final scene of Apex takes place at the ocean. Sasha stands at the water's edge and holds Tommy's lucky compass in her hand. The compass he always carried. The compass he was holding when he warned her that their luck might have run out. She looks at it for a long moment, and then she throws it into the sea. It is not a gesture of forgetting. It is a gesture of release. She is not letting go of Tommy. She is letting go of the guilt. She is letting go of the rope. The same rope she released on the troll wall in Norway, the one she has been holding inside herself ever since, the one that has been pulling her down into grief and self-blame for 5 months. She releases it now, finally and completely, into the water. And then she turns away from the ocean and walks forward. The film ends. Charlize Theron. Charlize Theron was born on August 7, 1975, in Benoni, a town situated in the Greater Johannesburg area of South Africa. She was the only child of Charles and Gerda Theron, a couple of Afrikaner descent who ran a road construction company and lived on a working farm outside the city. Her ancestry was a blend of French Huguenot, German, and Dutch heritage, and the family spoke Afrikaans as their first language. From her very earliest years, the farm was both her home and her world, and while she was expected to tend to livestock and participate in the daily work of rural life, it was immediately obvious that she had inherited an artistic restlessness that the farm could not fully contain. Her passion for dance revealed itself when she was very young. By the age of 6, she was already attending ballet lessons, and it quickly became clear that this was not simply a childhood hobby. She was genuinely talented, and her parents, recognizing this, did everything they could to nurture it. By the age of 12, she had been sent to a boarding school in Johannesburg that specialized in the performing arts. She was studying classical ballet, flamenco, and contemporary dance, and she was also being introduced to drama classes, which planted the earliest seeds of what would eventually become her extraordinary acting career. She was disciplined, serious about her craft, and determined in ways that children rarely are. But the Theron household, for all its apparent outward normalcy, was carrying a darkness. Her father Charles had fallen into alcoholism over the years, and that alcoholism had made him violent. The home that Charlize grew up in was not a safe one, and by the time she entered her teenage years, the situation had become genuinely dangerous. In 1991, when Charlize was just 15 years old, everything came to a head in the most traumatic way possible. Her father came home in a drunken rage and attacked both Charlize and her mother, firing a gun at them. Gerda, in an act of desperate self-defense, retrieved her own firearm and shot and killed her husband. This shooting was legally ruled self-defense. Gerda Theron was never charged with any crime. But Charlize had witnessed her father's death at the hands of her mother at the age of 15, and that experience left a mark that she has carried with her throughout her life. In interviews across the decades since, she has spoken about it with remarkable openness, refusing to hide it or let it define her in a limiting way, even as she acknowledges that it shaped who she became. The year after this tragedy, Charlize entered a modeling competition in Johannesburg at the age of 16, at her mother's encouragement. She won. That victory led her to Italy, where she participated in the International New Model Today competition in Positano and won that as well, which earned her a lucrative annual contract with a Milan modeling agency. For a full year she traveled across Europe, working the catwalks of one of the most glamorous fashion industries in the world. She was 17 years old, living out of suitcases, building a career in a world that was entirely foreign to her just a short time before. At 18, she moved to New York City. She had not abandoned her first love. She enrolled in the Joffrey Ballet School, one of the most prestigious dance institutions in the world, determined to pursue the career in classical ballet she had been training for since childhood. She supported herself with modeling work on the side. For a brief period, it seemed like the life she had dreamed of might actually be within reach. And then her knee gave out. The injury she sustained during her studies at Joffrey was severe enough to end her dance career permanently. She was 19 years old, she had no formal acting training, she was living in New York far from her home in South Africa, and the one path she had been working toward her entire life had just been closed to her forever. Her mother, who had always believed in her, suggested acting. Charlize took the suggestion seriously. She moved to Los Angeles on a one-way ticket her mother bought her, with very little money and no industry connections whatsoever. Those early months in Hollywood were genuinely difficult. She went from agent to agent along Hollywood Boulevard and found no interest. Her thick Afrikaner accent was working against her in auditions. She spent hours watching American television, training herself to speak without it, drilling away at the accent until she could pass for someone who had grown up speaking English without a trace of South Africa in her voice. She was also dealing with something more pressing and immediate. Her South African bank account would not transfer funds to an American bank, and the teller at a Los Angeles bank refused to help her access what little money she had from home. The argument that followed, with Charlize shouting at the teller in frustration, caught the attention of a man standing in line behind her. His name was John Crosby, and he was a Hollywood talent manager. He handed her his card. That shouting match in a Los Angeles bank was, improbably, the moment her acting career began. Crosby signed her, enrolled her in acting classes with renowned coach Ivana Chubbuck, and began submitting her for auditions. Her first screen appearance came in 1995 with a non-speaking role in Children of the Corn 3, a direct-to-video horror film. It was not glamorous, but it was a credit. The following year she appeared in 2 Days in the Valley, a crime ensemble film in which she played a lingerie-clad assassin, and the role got people talking. Tom Hanks, who saw something in her, cast her in That Thing You Do in 1997. That same year she appeared opposite Keanu Reeves and Al Pacino in The Devil's Advocate, playing the possessed wife of Reeves' lawyer, and suddenly Hollywood was paying attention. Disney cast her in Mighty Joe Young in 1998. The Cider House Rules followed in 1999. She was working with major names, and she was building the kind of momentum that most actors spend a decade trying to find. But it was 2003 that changed everything. Monster, directed by Patty Jenkins, asked Charlize Theron to play Aileen Wuornos, a real-life serial killer who was executed in Florida in 2002. The role required total transformation. She gained nearly 40 pounds for the film. She had her eyebrows bleached and wore prosthetics and makeup that made her virtually unrecognizable. She sat with the character day after day, finding the humanity inside a woman that the world had written off as a monster. The performance she delivered was so complete, so unflinching, and so genuinely affecting that the film community did not quite know what to do with it except give her every major award it had available. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. She won the Golden Globe. She was celebrated by everyone from Nelson Mandela, who personally honored her at his foundation in Johannesburg shortly after, to the Hollywood community that had taken years to look past her beauty and see what she was actually capable of. The Oscar win could have trapped her. Many actresses find that a career-defining transformation role becomes a ceiling rather than a launching pad, because the industry does not know how to think beyond it. Charlize refused to let that happen. She returned immediately to the kind of work that challenged her, appearing in North Country in 2005 and earning a second Academy Award nomination for her portrayal of a woman fighting sexual harassment in an iron mine. She appeared in the unconventional Arrested Development on television, playing a bizarre romantic interest in the show's third season. She took on science fiction with Aeon Flux in 2005 and later with Prometheus in 2012. She played an evil queen in Snow White and the Huntsman in 2012. She played a comic gunslinger in A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014. Each role was a deliberate refusal to repeat herself. Then came George Miller's Mad Max, Fury Road in 2015, and it completed the second chapter of her career. Playing Imperator Furiosa, a fierce warrior who drives the entire plot of the film and matches Tom Hardy's Max at every turn, Charlize Theron announced herself definitively as an action star. It was a physically brutal shoot, famously difficult and shot over many months in the Namibian desert, and she was in the thick of it every single day. The film won 6 Academy Awards and became one of the most acclaimed action films in decades, and her role in it is considered one of the defining female performances in that genre. She built on that platform with Atomic Blonde in 2017, a spy thriller in which she played an undercover MI6 agent during the fall of the Berlin Wall. The fight choreography in that film, much of it performed by Theron herself, is considered some of the finest ever put on screen. In 2019 she earned her 3rd Oscar nomination for Bombshell, in which she played journalist Megyn Kelly navigating the sexual harassment scandal that brought down Roger Ailes at Fox News. The transformation was, once again, extraordinary, with prosthetics and precise physical mimicry that made her indistinguishable from Kelly on screen. She also began producing seriously through her company Denver and Delilah Productions, taking genuine creative control over her projects. The Old Guard in 2020, a Netflix original about immortal mercenaries, was both a starring role and a production she shepherded, and its success was enough to generate a sequel in 2025. She has continued to appear in the Fast and Furious franchise across multiple installments, and has been announced for Christopher Nolan's upcoming epic The Odyssey. In her personal life, Charlize Theron has remained deeply private about her relationships while being publicly open about other aspects of her life. She was in a long-term relationship with actor Stuart Townsend from 2001 to 2010. She was briefly engaged to actor Sean Penn in 2015 before the relationship ended. She adopted 2 children as a single mother, a son named Jackson in 2012 and a daughter named August in 2015. In 2019, she publicly shared that Jackson is transgender and identifies as a girl, and she has been vocal and unwavering in her support for her daughter ever since. Her mother Gerda lives 2 minutes away from her in Los Angeles, and the two remain profoundly close. They both have matching fish tattoos. Charlize still speaks Afrikaans exclusively when she talks to her mother. She founded the Charlize Theron Africa Outreach Project in 2007, a non-profit organization dedicated to fighting HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa, with a particular focus on supporting African youth. The organization has raised tens of millions of dollars over the years and has built partnerships with major global health institutions. In 2008, she was appointed a United Nations Messenger of Peace by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon, a recognition of both her advocacy work and her influence on a global stage. She received her own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2005. For Apex, she called it the favorite film she has ever made, a statement that is difficult to dismiss coming from someone whose body of work spans over 3 decades at the absolute top of the industry. Taron Egerton. Taron David Egerton was born on November 10, 1989, in Birkenhead, a town in Merseyside on the northwest coast of England. His first name is a version of the traditional Welsh name Taron, which means thunder, and the spelling itself came from a mistake his mother made when filling out the paperwork, writing an O where the second A should have been. It is a detail that has followed him throughout his life, and one he has spoken about with good humor, because it suits him in ways he could never have planned. He came into the world in England, but he has always considered himself Welsh through and through, a self-identification rooted in both his grandmother's Welsh heritage and the years he spent growing up in Wales. His father ran a bed and breakfast, and his mother worked in social services, helping vulnerable people navigate difficult circumstances. It was a modest, grounded household, far removed from the glamour of the entertainment industry. Taron spent his early childhood on the Wirral Peninsula before the family relocated to Llanfairpwllgwyngyll, the small village on the Welsh island of Anglesey famous for having one of the longest place names in the world. He went to primary school there, began learning Welsh, and developed the particular sense of identity that comes from growing up in a small, tightly knit community with a strong cultural character. When he was 12, the family moved again, this time to Aberystwyth on the Welsh coast, and he grew up the rest of the way there. He has described himself as a cheeky kid who probably thought he was more of a troublemaker than he actually was, and who had very few serious problems at school despite what he imagined about himself. From a young age, performing was clearly where he was drawn. He joined local theater groups and performed in school plays, and by the time he was completing his secondary education, he knew with certainty that acting was what he wanted to do professionally. He applied to and was accepted by the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, one of the most prestigious and competitive acting schools in the world, and spent 3 years there earning his Bachelor of Arts degree in acting, graduating in 2012. His time at RADA gave him the formal technical foundation that would allow him to operate at the highest levels of the profession, but what RADA cannot teach, the raw instinct and emotional intelligence that he brought to his work was already there when he arrived. He is conversant in Welsh, though he has admitted with characteristic honesty that his Welsh is not as sharp as it once was, having spent so much of his adult life in London. His professional career began almost immediately after graduation. His first acting credit was a small role in 2 episodes of the long-running ITV crime drama Lewis in 2012, playing a character named Liam J. The following year he was cast in the main ensemble of the Sky One series The Smoke, a drama about a fire station in London dealing with the aftermath of a traumatic incident. It was not a splashy vehicle, but it gave him experience working consistently in front of a camera across multiple episodes and in a role with genuine dramatic weight. He also appeared in short films and stage productions during this period, building his range and getting comfortable with different formats and scales of performance. The moment that changed his career entirely came in 2013 when he was cast by director Matthew Vaughn in Kingsman: The Secret Service. The film, an adaptation of the comic book The Secret Service by Mark Millar and Dave Gibbons, was a stylized action comedy spy thriller that required its lead to be physically credible, genuinely funny, emotionally grounded, and charismatic enough to anchor an entire film against established names like Colin Firth, Michael Caine, and Samuel L. Jackson. Taron Egerton was 23 years old and had almost no film experience. He got the job and he delivered completely. Playing Gary, nicknamed Eggsy, a young working-class man recruited into a secret spy organization, he brought an energy and a naturalness to the role that critics immediately noticed and audiences immediately loved. The film was released in 2015 and grossed over $400 million at the box office. He signed a 3-picture deal with 20th Century Fox shortly after. He was named one of GQ's 50 best-dressed British men in 2015 and again in 2016. Overnight he was a star. What followed was a remarkable exercise in deliberate and intelligent career management. Rather than simply riding the Kingsman wave and collecting paychecks in similar roles, he made choices designed to demonstrate range. In 2014, alongside the first Kingsman, he appeared in Testament of Youth, a biographical drama based on Vera Britton's memoir about the First World War and the devastating losses it inflicted on a generation of young British people. He played Edward Britton, Vera's brother, and his work in the film earned him a nomination for Best British Newcomer at the BFI London Film Festival. Critics began writing about him not just as a charming action hero but as an actor capable of genuine emotional depth. In 2015 he appeared opposite Tom Hardy in Legend, a crime film about the Kray twins, in a supporting role that further demonstrated his ability to hold his own in serious dramatic company. In 2016 he took on the lead role in Eddie the Eagle, a biographical film about Eddie Edwards, the famously optimistic and wildly underqualified British ski jumper who competed in the 1988 Winter Olympics and became a beloved underdog story. Egerton played Edwards with warmth, humor, and a physical commitment that required him to learn aspects of ski jumping for the role. The film was well received, and his performance was singled out as the heart of it. That same year he voiced Johnny, a singing gorilla, in the animated musical film Sing, demonstrating that his vocal abilities were genuinely strong and that he could hold his own in the notoriously competitive world of animated film casting. He reprised his Kingsman role in 2017's The Golden Circle, the sequel to the original film, which brought in an even larger and more eclectic cast and continued the franchise's blend of elaborate action, dark humor, and style. Then came the role that defined the next chapter of his career entirely. In 2019, Egerton was cast as Elton John in Rocketman, a biographical musical film about John's life from his childhood through his early years of global stardom. What made the role extraordinary in both its ambition and its execution was that Egerton did not lip-sync. He sang every single song himself, performing live in each take during production. He spent an enormous amount of time with Elton John personally, listening to stories about his life, his pain, his addictions, and his loves, and Elton was so invested in the process that he insisted Egerton reinterpret the songs rather than merely imitate them. The result was a performance of stunning emotional range, and Egerton won the Golden Globe Award for Best Actor in a Motion Picture Musical or Comedy for it. He was also nominated for a BAFTA for Best Actor in a Leading Role and received a Grammy nomination for his contribution to the film's soundtrack. It was a genuinely remarkable achievement. In 2022 he starred as Jimmy Keene in Blackbird, an Apple TV Plus miniseries based on the true story of a man who is offered his freedom from a federal prison if he can extract a confession from a suspected serial killer. It was a 6-episode run of serious, sustained dramatic television, and Egerton carried every minute of it with an intelligence and an emotional precision that earned him a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Lead Actor. In 2023 he played Hank Rogers in Tetris, a biographical thriller about the extraordinary legal and political battle to bring the famous game out of Soviet Russia and to the global market. In 2024 he starred in Carry On, a Netflix action thriller about a TSA agent being blackmailed by a terrorist at an airport, and the film was a massive streaming success. He appeared briefly in a West End stage production of the play Cock in 2022, making his debut on the London stage, though he ultimately had to exit the production for personal reasons. He has been an ambassador for the Motor Neurone Disease Association, a cause he took up after losing his grandmother to the disease. He is open about having questioned his own sexuality during his teenage years, and he has been a visible and consistent supporter of the LGBTQ community throughout his career. He was in a long-term relationship with assistant director Emily Thomas for approximately 6 years beginning in 2016. He lives in West London. For Apex, director Baltasar Kormákur described seeing him in this villain role for the first time as comparable to watching Jack Nicholson in The Shining, and Charlize Theron, who does not give praise carelessly, called him one of the best actors she has ever worked with in any context. Eric Bana. Eric Bana was born Eric Martin Andrew Banadinovic on August 9, 1968, in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. His father, Ivan Banadinovic, was Croatian, originally from Zagreb, and worked as a logistics manager for the American company Caterpillar Incorporated. His mother, Eleanor, was of German descent and worked as a hairdresser. He was the younger of 2 brothers, his older brother Anthony growing to the remarkable height of 6 feet and 8 inches, making Eric, at 6 feet 3, the shorter sibling in a family of very tall men. They grew up in the suburb of Tullamarine in Melbourne, a working-class neighborhood close to the airport, in a household that was not wealthy but was stable, loving, and full of laughter. From the time he could form coherent sentences, Eric Bana was making people laugh. He discovered the ability to mimic when he was 6 or 7 years old, starting with his grandfather. He would imitate the old man's walk, his voice, his particular gestures, and the family would fall about laughing. From his grandfather he moved on to his teachers at school, working out quickly that impersonating authority figures was both a source of genuine amusement and, strategically, a way to get out of trouble. He was the class entertainer from the beginning, and while he genuinely enjoyed school, he was also deeply passionate about things outside it. He loved cars with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and by the time he was 14 he wanted to leave school entirely and become a motor mechanic. His father refused to allow it, and insisted he finish his education, a decision Eric has been grateful for ever since. At 15 he bought his first car, a 1974 XB Ford Falcon Coupe, for $1,100 Australian dollars, and it became one of his most enduring passions. He has kept that car his entire life, competed in motor racing events with it, and eventually made a documentary about his relationship with it. During his teenage years he watched Mad Max, the 1979 film starring Mel Gibson, and something clicked into place. He decided then that he wanted to be an actor. It was not an immediate ambition in the sense of taking action on it right away. He finished school, moved around, did odd jobs, and it was not until 1991, when he was working as a barman at the Castle Hotel in Melbourne, that he was persuaded by friends to try stand-up comedy at an open mic night at a local club. He performed, and the response was good enough that he became a regular. He began performing in bars and clubs across Australia, touring in the way that young comedians do, playing to 200 strangers in a different town every night, learning how to hold a room and how to recover from failure and how to shape material into something that reliably landed. He has spoken about those days with enormous affection, saying that performing on the road to hostile or in different audiences taught him more about himself and his craft than any formal training could have. His television debut came in 1993 when he appeared on Tonight Live, a late-night talk show hosted by Steve Vizard. His performance there got the attention of the producers of Full Frontal, a popular Australian sketch comedy series, and they invited him to join as both a writer and a performer. He spent 3 years on Full Frontal, and during that time he became one of the most popular comedians in Australia. He developed a character called Poida that became a cultural phenomenon in the country, and his impressions of celebrities, politicians, and public figures were genuinely sharp and funny rather than merely imitative. He was a real talent, not just a competent mimic, and Australian audiences recognized the difference. In 1996 he left Full Frontal and created his own show, simply titled Eric, followed quickly by the Eric Bana show Live in 1997. The show was written and performed by Bana and featured skits, stand-up, and celebrity guests, but it struggled to find an audience large enough to sustain it, and was cancelled after 8 episodes. Despite that setback, the work he had done on Full Frontal was enough to earn him the Logie Award for Most Popular Comedy Personality in 1997, one of the most prestigious recognitions in Australian television. That same year, in one of the most unexpected casting decisions in Australian film history, director Andrew Dominik approached Bana about playing Mark "Chopper" Reed, one of Australia's most notorious criminals, in a biographical drama that would take his career in a direction no one had anticipated. Dominik himself had reservations about casting a comedian in such a demanding and dramatically heavy role, but something about Bana convinced him to take the risk. Bana threw himself into the preparation with a commitment that left no room for doubt. He gained 30 pounds by eating junk food. He spent several days visiting Red in prison, studying his mannerisms, his speech patterns, the particular way he occupied physical space. He had extensive tattoos applied to his body with prosthetics and makeup every single morning, arriving on set at 4 in the morning for hours of application before filming could begin. He shaved his head. He made himself unrecognizable. And then he acted. Chopper was released in 2000 and the critical response was overwhelming. No one had expected what Bana delivered. The depth and complexity of his portrayal, the way he found something almost sympathetic in a man who was genuinely terrifying, left critics struggling for adjectives adequate to describe it. He won the Australian Film Institute Award for Best Actor in a Leading Role. The film began screening in the United States, and the same reaction followed. Directors in Hollywood started paying attention. Ridley Scott was making Black Hawk Down, his film about the 1993 Battle of Mogadishu, and Russell Crowe, who was involved in the production, personally requested that Bana be cast in the role of Sergeant Norm Gibson. Bana did not have to audition. He arrived in Hollywood already endorsed by one of its most powerful actors, and he delivered again. Black Hawk Down came out in 2001 and was a critical and commercial success. Lee saw it and cast Bana as Bruce Banner, the tortured scientist who becomes the Hulk, in his 2003 superhero film. The role required Bana to anchor a technically complex production with genuine dramatic weight, and he did it at the age of 34, making him the youngest person to play Bruce Banner on screen. Brad Pitt saw Chopper and personally requested Bana for the role of Hector, the heroic Trojan prince, in Wolfgang Petersen's Troy in 2004. It was one of the biggest productions of its era, and Bana held his own opposite Pitt and Orlando Bloom across 2.5 hours of epic cinema. In 2005, Steven Spielberg cast him in Munich, a tense and morally complex historical thriller about the Israeli intelligence operation that followed the 1972 Olympic massacre. Bana played Avner, an Israeli Mossad agent tasked with hunting down the men responsible for the attack, and the performance is considered among the finest of his career. The film demanded sustained emotional intelligence across a long and difficult shoot, and Bana gave Spielberg everything that was needed. He appeared alongside Daniel Craig and Geoffrey Rush in an ensemble that made Munich one of the most acclaimed films of that decade. He continued working steadily through the 2000s and 2010s across a wide range of projects. He played Henry VIII in The Other Boleyn Girl in 2008. He starred in the romantic science fiction film The Time Traveler's Wife in 2009 opposite Rachel McAdams. He played the villain Nero in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek reboot in 2009, appearing with Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto in the film that reinvigorated that entire franchise. He made a brief but memorable appearance in Judd Apatow's Funny People in 2009 alongside Adam Sandler and Seth Rogen, demonstrating that his comedic origins had not left him. He made his debut as both director and subject with Love the Beast in 2009, a personal documentary about his relationship with his Ford Falcon, featuring conversations with Jeremy Clarkson, Jay Leno, and Dr. Phil, which is one of the more unexpected filmmaking combinations in recent documentary history. He won a second Australian Film Institute Award for Best Actor for Romulus, My Father in 2007, a quiet and deeply personal Australian drama that showed audiences a side of him the Hollywood blockbusters had not always made room for. He starred in the miniseries Dirty John in 2018, playing a charismatic and manipulative con man in a true crime story that attracted significant attention. He returned to Australia to make The Dry in 2020, an Outback thriller in which he played a federal agent returning to his hometown to investigate a suspected murder-suicide. The film was an enormous critical and commercial success in Australia and has been his most visible recent Australian work before Apex. In his personal life, Eric Bana has been consistently and deliberately private in a way that is increasingly rare among people of his profile. He met Rebecca Gleason, a publicist, while working on Full Frontal in 1995. The couple became romantically involved, and in 1996 he won a trip for two to the United States. He brought Rebecca, and proposed to her during that trip. They married in 1997 and have been together ever since. Their son Klaus was born in 1999, and their daughter Sophia in 2002. The family has always been based in Melbourne, and Bana has consistently chosen family time over Hollywood proximity, turning down roles and walking away from productions to go home to his wife and children. He was appointed a member of the Order of Australia in the 2019 Queen's Birthday Honours for his services to the performing arts and to charitable organisations, which is one of the most meaningful recognitions available to an Australian citizen. He remains passionate about motor racing, charitable work, and maintaining a life that is grounded in something more real than the industry he works in. His co-stars and directors consistently describe him as humble, generous, and free of the ego that so often accompanies his level of success. For Apex, working in the Australian landscape of his home country alongside two world-class actors, he brought exactly the quality of grounded, physically credible, emotionally honest performance that has defined every significant role of his remarkable career. The budget. Netflix has not officially and publicly disclosed the exact production budget for Apex 2026, which is completely standard practice for the streaming giant. Netflix almost never releases precise budget figures for its original films, preferring to keep its financial details internal and away from public scrutiny. However, the film's production profile makes it very possible for industry analysts to estimate a reasonable range, and based on all the available information, industry insiders and analysts have placed the budget of Apex somewhere between $60 million and $80 million. To understand why that number makes sense, you have to look at every factor that drives production costs on a film like this. First and most obviously, the cast. Charlize Theron is one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood. She is an Academy Award winner, a globally recognized star, and a proven box office draw with decades of A-list credibility behind her. Actors of her caliber command salaries in the range of $10 to $20 million per picture for major productions, and her dual role as both lead actress and producer on Apex would have added further to her deal. Taron Egerton, while not yet at Theron's fee bracket, is a rising name whose profile has grown enormously in recent years following Rocketman and Carry On, and his deal would have reflected that trajectory. Eric Bana, a genuinely accomplished and respected actor with an international career spanning more than 2 decades, would have added further above-the-line cost to the production. Then there is the director. Baltasar Kormákur is not a cheap filmmaker. He operates on a scale. His survival thriller Everest in 2015 carried a budget of $65 million. His film Two Guns in 2013 cost $61 million. Both of those productions were made for traditional theatrical studio distribution, which typically carries different financial pressures than a Netflix original, but they give a reliable baseline for understanding what Kormákur films tend to cost when they involve location shooting, star-driven ensembles, and ambitious technical execution. Apex fits comfortably within that range and possibly pushes toward the upper end of it, given that Netflix was specifically investing in a theatrical quality action film designed to compete globally. The production logistics themselves were extraordinarily expensive. Principal photography began in February 2025 and was based primarily in Sydney and the Blue Mountains of New South Wales in Australia. But the shoot also extended to Norway for the troll wall sequences that open the film. Shooting in 2 countries on different continents, across extreme terrain including deep cave systems, freezing underground water, vertical cliff faces, and fast-moving river rapids, is not cheap by any definition. The production at one point reduced the crew to around 40 people in wetsuits navigating submerged cave passages to capture certain sequences, which sounds like cost-cutting but is actually the opposite. Getting a professional film crew, with all their equipment, safely in and out of locations accessible only by helicopter drops and underwater swimming requires specialized logistics, safety coordinators, specialized equipment, and days of preparation for what might end up being minutes of screen time. The visual effects budget alone was substantial. The film employed 5 separate major VFX houses: Framestore, ILM, Rising Sun Pictures, Union VFX, and Host VFX. Framestore had previously worked with Kormákur on both Beast and Everest, and their involvement here indicates a relationship of trust built over multiple productions. ILM is one of the most expensive and prestigious visual effects houses in the world, and their presence on a production signals that the VFX demands were significant. The Norwegian mountain sequences, portions of the cave environments, certain river and waterfall shots, and background elements throughout the Australian sequences would all have required digital enhancement. 5 VFX houses working simultaneously on a single production is not a sign of a modest budget. Charlize Theron trained extensively with world-class rock climber Beth Rodden to prepare for the role, and that training represented months of preparation time with a specialist that would have been covered by the production. 2 Olympic-level kayakers, River Mutton and Luca Jones, were brought in as stunt doubles for the most dangerous water sequences, and both were world-class athletes whose involvement did not come cheaply. The stunt coordination across the entire production, covering climbing, kayaking, underwater fights, cave sequences, and physical combat, would have represented a significant line item in the budget all on its own. To put the $60 to $80 million estimate in context, it is worth noting that major Netflix action thrillers of this type and ambition typically fall within this range. The Old Guard, Charlize Theron's previous Netflix action film, had a budget of approximately $70 million. Carry On, Taron Egerton's Netflix thriller from 2024, was estimated at around $40 to $50 million for a more contained, single-location production. Apex is larger in scope than Carry On and broadly comparable to The Old Guard, which makes the $60 to $80 million estimate feel credible and well-grounded. Since the film is a Netflix original and not a traditional theatrical release, it does not generate box office figures in the conventional sense. Netflix measures its film performance through hours viewed in the first 91 days and through its weekly top 10 charts. On those metrics, Apex performed extraordinarily well. It debuted at number 1 globally on Netflix with 38.2 million views in its first week and held that position for a second consecutive week, which places it among the most watched Netflix original films of 2026. Funny and memorable moments on set. Behind the chaos of the shoot and all its physical brutality, what comes through in every interview, press appearance, and behind-the-scenes account from the production of Apex is that the set was, at its core, a genuinely warm and often very funny place to be. The combination of Charlize Theron's dry and disarming humor, Taron Egerton's natural wit and playfulness, and Baltasar Kormákur's fondness for unexpected spontaneity created an atmosphere that balanced the extreme conditions of filming with real laughter. Perhaps the single most talked about funny story from the entire production involves Taron Egerton's first week in Australia. When the shoot began, Egerton was not yet needed for his scenes, because the film's opening sequences before Sasha meets Ben were being filmed first. This meant that while Charlize Theron was out in the Blue Mountains battling rivers, scaling rock faces, and throwing herself off cliffs into water, Taron Egerton was spending his first week in Sydney relaxing on Bondi Beach and, by his own cheerful admission, having quite a nice time. He has been completely open about this, telling Netflix in an interview that he was working half the time and enjoying the beach the rest of it, while Charlize was out in the wilderness enduring conditions that most people would not survive a single day of. When director Baltasar Kormákur showed Egerton footage of Theron leaping from a great height into a river, doing it completely calmly and then doing it again 4 more times without a single complaint, Egerton was left somewhere between deeply impressed and quietly horrified at what was waiting for him once his own filming began. He said he was so impressed watching her that it raised his standards for his own performance before he had filmed a single frame. The rope scene involving Taron Egerton became one of the most talked about and quietly hilarious stories from the production. In one sequence, Egerton's character Ben is shown swinging naked from a rope, and it was a scene that Kormákur himself described as having a lightness to it despite the surrounding darkness of the character. What the director did not fully explain in interviews, but what various behind-the-scenes accounts have touched on, is that filming a scene of that particular nature in the middle of the Australian bush, with a full crew watching, required a very specific kind of professional composure and good humor from everyone involved. Egerton has spoken about the scene with characteristically relaxed humor, and the crew's reaction to filming it was reportedly one of the more memorable afternoons of the entire shoot. Charlize Theron's relationship with the kayak became a running joke throughout production that has extended well beyond the filming itself. Despite calling Apex her favorite movie she has ever made, Theron has been emphatic in interviews that the kayaking left a permanent psychological mark on her. She told the Skip Intro podcast in plain terms that she simply cannot look at a kayak anymore. She called it that bad. To understand why this is funny as well as completely understandable, you have to appreciate the sheer volume of kayaking she did during production. The rivers and rapids of New South Wales are not gentle recreational waterways. They are powerful, fast, and in certain sections genuinely dangerous. Theron trained in kayaking to a level sufficient to handle calmer sequences herself, while Olympic-level kayakers River Mutton and Luca Jones handled the most extreme rapids as her doubles. But even the sequences Theron performed herself involved enough time in cold, fast water to leave her with what can only be described as a complicated relationship with the sport. The image of one of Hollywood's most formidable action stars, a woman who has survived the Namibian desert in Mad Max and the back streets of Berlin in Atomic Blonde, announcing with complete sincerity that a kayak has broken something in her, struck every interviewer who heard it as genuinely funny. The dynamic between Theron and Egerton on set was one that multiple crew members and both actors themselves have described as unexpectedly warm and funny, given that their characters spend the entire film trying to kill each other. In press interviews they sat together and lobbed compliments at each other with the ease of people who had genuinely become friends during the shoot. Egerton called Theron one of, if not the, hardest working actors he had ever encountered in his career. Theron responded by calling Egerton one of the top 5 best actors she had ever worked with in her entire life. The mutual appreciation was genuine and visible, and the humor between them came from the contrast between how brutal their relationship was on screen and how comfortable and funny they were with each other off it. One of the stories that made the rounds in press coverage was Theron's account of how Egerton would constantly surprise the entire production with unexpected choices that nobody had anticipated. She described walking off set after scenes and turning to the producers with an expression of disbelief, not because something had gone wrong, but because Egerton had done something so unexpected and so right that the whole crew stood there wondering where it came from. She said that some of the most iconic moments in the finished film exist entirely because of his instincts on the day. What she did not fully describe but left amusingly implied was that these moments often left the director equally startled, in the best possible way, and that Kormákur would sometimes have to reorient the whole crew's expectations after Egerton had decided to go somewhere completely different with a scene mid-take. The physical training that both actors underwent before and during production provided a reliable supply of both pride and embarrassment. Theron was a complete beginner at rock climbing when she began preparing for the role, and she has spoken about how liberating and terrifying it was to learn a skill for which there is genuinely no formula, no safe choreography, and no guarantee that what worked on one section of rock will work on the next. During early training sessions, before she had built confidence and technique, there were apparently plenty of moments of struggle, frustration, and the particular kind of absurdist humor that comes from watching an Oscar winner clinging to a bouldering wall and trying to figure out which way her hand should be pointing. She trained with legendary climber Beth Rodden, and Rodden has spoken about what a committed and genuinely capable student Theron turned out to be. But the early days of that process were apparently full of moments that Theron herself found both humbling and quietly hilarious. Egerton faced his own version of the same experience when it came to preparing for a role that required a different kind of physicality than he had previously developed. He has done action roles before and has been through serious physical transformation for Kingsman, but the demands of playing Ben in Apex required something beyond the gym-oriented training he was accustomed to. He needed to move through the wilderness with the specific fluency of someone who had lived outdoors his whole life, to handle a crossbow convincingly, and to carry the physical menace of a trained and experienced hunter. The gap between where he started that preparation and where he needed to end up provided plenty of material for his own self-deprecating humor in interviews. And he has been honest about the fact that some of the early rehearsals for the more physically demanding sequences looked considerably less impressive than what eventually ended up in the film. The wristwatch continuity error that eagle-eyed viewers spotted after the film's release also became a source of amusement after the fact. In the kayaking sequence near the 20-minute mark, Charlize Theron's character is wearing a wristwatch that mysteriously disappears when she picks up the kayak and then reappears briefly after she performs a role, before vanishing again in the next shot. The error was spotted almost immediately after the film dropped, discussed widely on Reddit, and became a running joke among viewers who rewatched the sequence specifically to confirm it. Nobody on the production has publicly addressed how it happened, which is in itself part of the joke. Somewhere in the editing suite, across multiple passes through the footage with 5 separate VFX houses involved in the production, a wristwatch decided to live its own independent life, and nobody caught it. The Australian wildlife that surrounded the production at all times was not exactly part of the formal cast, but it contributed to the general atmosphere of unpredictability that any film shoot in the Australian bush has to contend with. Australia's ecosystem is famously and aggressively unhelpful to human beings who wander into it, and a production involving 40-plus crew members in wetsuits in caves and on river banks for months would have had no shortage of encounters with the local fauna. None of the specific wildlife incidents have been formally documented in press materials, but anyone who has spent time in the Blue Mountains region will understand that a film shoot of this scope in that terrain does not go 3 months without at least one spider, one snake, or one confused and territorial bird making itself known at a professionally inconvenient moment. Overall, the portrait that emerges from the behind-the-scenes accounts of Apex is of a production that was genuinely grueling, technically demanding, and physically exhausting, and that was simultaneously full of the kind of laughter and human connection that tends to happen when talented, funny people are thrown together into impossible conditions and have no choice but to find something to laugh about. The kayak joke, the beach week, the rope scene, the spontaneous acting choices that left the director blinking, the vanishing wristwatch. All of it adds up to a production story that is as entertaining in its own way as the film itself. The literary origin and its 100-year history. To fully understand Apex 2026 as a cultural object, you have to go back exactly 102 years, to January 19, 1924, when an American writer named Richard Connell published a short story in Collier's Weekly magazine under the original title The Hounds of Zaroff. It was later republished and became universally known as The Most Dangerous Game, and it went on to win the O. Henry Award for Best Short Story that year. Nobody at the time could have anticipated that this relatively compact piece of adventure fiction would become the single most adapted, most imitated, and most culturally reproduced story premise in American popular entertainment across the following century. But that is exactly what happened, and Apex 2026 is one of the most recent and most high-profile entries in that enormous lineage. Connell's story is straightforward in its premise, and deceptively deep in its implications. A famous big-game hunter named Rainsford falls from a ship in the Caribbean and swims to a remote island owned by General Zaroff, a displaced Russian aristocrat of enormous wealth and refinement. Zaroff is charming, educated, and cultured. He drinks fine wine, plays chess, and appreciates literature. He is also, as Rainsford discovers with mounting horror, a hunter of human beings. Zaroff has grown bored with hunting animals because they cannot reason or plan or feel genuine fear in the way that makes the chase intellectually satisfying. Human beings, he argues with perfect calm, are the most dangerous game, because they alone can think and scheme and fight back. He gives his human prey a head start and a knife and hunts them through the island with dogs and weapons. It is, to him, simply the logical endpoint of a hunter's career. What made the story so powerful and so enduring was not merely its thriller mechanics, though those were skillfully constructed. It was the ideas buried beneath the surface. Connell was writing in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, a conflict that had industrialized human killing on a scale previously unimaginable. The concept of the hunt, long associated with aristocratic privilege and masculine virtue, was being turned inside out by a world in which European nations had just spent 4 years methodically hunting and killing each other's young men in the mud of the Western Front. Connell's story tapped directly into that collective anxiety. It asked, with considerable unease, what exactly separates the civilized man from the savage predator, and whether wealth and culture and refinement are any kind of guarantee that a person will not, when given the power and the isolation to do so, treat other human beings as prey. The story's villain is not a brute. He is a sophisticated man who has constructed an elaborate philosophical justification for something that is fundamentally a crime against humanity. The story also reflected the particular anxieties of its era in other ways. Zaroff is specifically a Russian aristocrat, a man displaced by the 1917 revolution, and his presence on a private island where he rules without accountability reflects the American cultural anxiety about the collapse of the old European order, and what happens to power when it becomes unmoored from social restraint. The big game hunting safaris that were fashionable among wealthy Americans in the 1920s, popularized in no small part by Theodore Roosevelt's famous African expeditions, provided the cultural backdrop against which the story's central horror played out. Hunting was not just a sport. It was a cultural performance of dominance and mastery and privilege, and Connell's story pushed that performance to its logical and disturbing conclusion. The story won the O. Henry Award, entered school curricula across America, and almost immediately began generating adaptations. The first film version came in 1932 from RKO Pictures, starring Joel McCrea, and it was produced on the same sets as King Kong, with some of the same cast members. It was a critical and commercial success. Further adaptations followed in 1945, 1956, and beyond. Orson Welles dramatized it for radio in 1943. It has since been adapted directly or indirectly for film and television dozens of times across multiple genres and national film industries. The core premise has been so thoroughly absorbed into popular culture that writers and filmmakers now use it without necessarily referencing Connell consciously. The concept of a human being hunted by another human being in a remote or isolated location, with a head start and a countdown, is simply part of the shared vocabulary of thriller storytelling in the 21st century. The films that draw most explicitly from Connell's template form a remarkable list. Hard Target in 1993 was a John Woo film set in New Orleans in which homeless veterans are hunted by wealthy clients paying for the experience. Surviving the Game in 1994 starred Ice-T as a homeless man lured into a hunting trip where he is the prey. The Condemned in 2007 placed convicts on an island and forced them to hunt each other for a reality television broadcast. The Hunger Games, published by Suzanne Collins in 2008 and adapted into one of the most commercially successful film franchises in history, is essentially the most dangerous game expanded into an entire dystopian society built around the ritual of sending young people to kill each other for the entertainment of the ruling class. Ready or Not in 2019 placed the premise in the context of a wealthy family's wedding tradition. Every one of these works owes a direct debt to Connell's 1924 story, and Apex 2026 sits clearly and self-consciously within the same tradition. What Apex does differently from most entries in this genre is one of the things that makes it culturally interesting. Connell's original story, and most of its adaptations, frame the hunted person as fundamentally helpless until they discover the capability to fight back. The power differential is vast and is part of the horror. Apex closes that gap significantly. Sasha is not an ordinary woman dropped into an extraordinary situation. She is an elite-level rock climber, an outdoor adventurer with decades of extreme experience in some of the most demanding environments on Earth. Ben has the advantage of local knowledge and a crossbow, but Sasha has physical capability, climbing skills, and a survival instinct that is the product of a lifetime spent in hostile terrain. The film is genuinely interested in the question of what happens when the prey is nearly as capable as the predator, and that is a more modern and more compelling version of the original premise. The survival film as a cultural form. The survival thriller as a film genre has a long and rich history that runs parallel to and intersects with the human hunting premise but extends far beyond it. At its most essential, the survival film is about stripping away everything that civilization provides and asking what remains. It is a genre that has always been particularly resonant in times of cultural anxiety, because it deals with the most fundamental question that any living creature faces. What will you do to stay alive, and what will that cost you in terms of who you are? Some of the earliest and most influential examples of the genre date back to the 1970s. Deliverance in 1972, directed by John Boorman, sent four suburban Atlanta businessmen on a canoe trip through rural Georgia and subjected them to escalating violence from the local population. It was a film that carried enormous cultural freight about urbanization, class, masculinity, and the relationship between supposedly civilized modern people and the wilder, more primal world they had largely abandoned. Alive in 1993, directed by Frank Marshall, told the true story of the Uruguayan rugby team whose plane crashed in the Andes in 1972 and who survived for 72 days in extreme conditions, eventually resorting to cannibalism. The Revenant in 2015, directed by Alejandro González Iñárritu and starring Leonardo DiCaprio, was set in the American frontier of the 1820s and followed a fur trapper left for dead by his companions who survived a brutal winter landscape driven entirely by the desire for vengeance. All of these films use physical survival as the frame for deeper questions about human nature, community, moral compromise, and what it means to be a person rather than simply an organism trying to persist. Apex positions itself within this tradition very deliberately. Director Baltasar Kormákur has spent his entire career working in this genre. Everest in 2015 told the true story of two separate climbing expeditions on Mount Everest that were struck by a catastrophic storm in 1996, killing 8 people. Adrift in 2018 told the true story of 2 sailors who survived a hurricane in the Pacific and spent 41 days adrift at sea. Beast in 2022 put Idris Elba and his daughters in a nature reserve in South Africa being hunted by a lion. Kormákur's filmmaking instinct is always to use extreme environment as a character in its own right, as a thing that actively shapes the human beings within it rather than simply providing a backdrop for their drama. Apex extends this instinct into a more explicitly thriller-oriented framework, but the core impulse is the same one that has driven his work for over a decade. The Australian Outback and its place in horror culture. The choice of Australia as the setting for Apex is not culturally neutral. Australia has a specific and well-established place in the popular imagination as a location of extreme and often hostile natural beauty where outsiders, particularly urban Western visitors, can encounter both the grandeur of an ancient landscape and dangers that the modern world has largely insulated people against. The continent is home to more venomous species than anywhere else on Earth. Its interior is one of the most remote and unforgiving environments a person can enter. Its history includes a colonial period of extraordinary violence against the indigenous population, and the landscape itself carries the weight of that history in ways that have become increasingly acknowledged in Australian cultural life. Australian cinema has developed a particularly rich tradition of horror and thriller filmmaking that uses the outback as a space where social norms dissolve and the worst of human nature can emerge unchallenged. Wolf Creek, released in 2005 and directed by Greg McLean, is the most directly relevant precursor to Apex within Australian cinema. It told the story of 3 young backpackers, 2 of them British tourists, who encounter a seemingly helpful local man named Mick Taylor in the remote Australian interior. Mick turns out to be a sadistic serial killer who has been preying on tourists in the outback for years. The film was loosely inspired by real events, including the crimes of Ivan Milat, a serial killer who murdered 7 backpackers in New South Wales between 1989 and 1992, and the case of Bradley John Murdoch, who murdered British tourist Peter Falconio in the outback in 2001. Wolf Creek was controversial precisely because it felt so grounded in a recognizable Australian social reality, even though its villain was an extreme amplification of that reality. Multiple critics drew explicit comparisons between Wolf Creek and Apex, particularly in the way both films used the friendliness and apparent helpfulness of the local villain as the setup for the horror that follows. Reviewers noted that Ben in Apex bears a strong thematic resemblance to Mick Taylor, and that the film participates in a particular genre of Australian horror in which the isolation of the outback becomes a condition under which a certain kind of violent male personality can operate without accountability or consequence. The Royal Hotel, released in 2023 and directed by Kitty Green, is another recent Australian film that works in this territory, following 2 American women working in a remote outback pub who encounter the particular menace of isolated, resentful masculinity in a community where there are no safe spaces and no reliable authorities. Apex shares the genre space with these films while differentiating itself through its scale, its international cast, and its explicit action thriller orientation. The Blue Mountains of New South Wales, where the majority of Apex was filmed, are themselves a place of significant cultural and historical meaning. They are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for their extraordinary biological diversity and their ancient landscape, which includes rock formations, cave systems, and river gorges that have been shaped over hundreds of millions of years. The mountains have been home to the Darug and Gundungurra peoples for at least tens of thousands of years, making them one of the most continuously inhabited landscapes in human history. The cave systems and river passages that appear so dramatically in Apex's most intense sequences are not merely cinematic settings. They are ancient geological structures with deep cultural significance to the people who have lived in and around them since long before European settlement. The film does not engage with that history explicitly, but it is present in the landscape even when unacknowledged. The cultural significance of the female survivor. One of the most important cultural conversations that Apex participates in is the long and evolving history of the female survivor figure in action and thriller cinema. For most of cinema's history, the woman in a survival scenario was positioned primarily as a victim. Her survival, when it happened, was typically facilitated by a male hero. She was the person being rescued rather than the person doing the surviving. This convention began to be challenged seriously in the late 1970s and early 1980s with the emergence of what film scholars call the final girl, a concept associated primarily with horror cinema, in which one female character survives at the end of a horror film by virtue of her intelligence, her resourcefulness, and often her moral seriousness compared to the other characters who are killed. Ellen Ripley in the Alien franchise, beginning in 1979, became the most iconic and culturally significant example of the female survivor in action cinema, a woman who was not waiting to be saved but was actively fighting to survive and protect others on her own terms. The tradition of the strong female action protagonist has been built upon and expanded in the decades since. Sarah Connor in the Terminator films became a cultural touchstone for female physical agency in action cinema. The women of Mad Max, Fury Road, a film in which the female characters collectively drive the entire plot while the male protagonist is essentially along for the ride, represented a watershed moment in how Hollywood understood and presented women in action contexts. Charlize Theron herself was central to both of those traditions, having played Imperator Furiosa in Mad Max and having built much of her late career identity around physically demanding roles that demanded genuine athletic commitment and portrayed women as fundamentally capable rather than fundamentally vulnerable. Apex is a direct continuation of this tradition. Sasha is not a character who survives despite being a woman. She survives because of specific skills and qualities she has developed over a lifetime, including extraordinary physical conditioning, technical expertise in rock climbing, experience in hostile environments, and a psychological resilience that has been forged through genuine suffering. Her confrontation with Ben is not framed as a woman being terrorized by a man, even though it is also that. It is framed as two extraordinary physical human beings in a contest of survival in which the outcome is genuinely uncertain for most of the film. The fact that she wins is not presented as surprising or miraculous. It is presented as the result of who she is and what she has built herself into over the course of her life. This framing carries cultural significance that goes beyond the film itself. In a broader cultural moment where conversations about gender, power, vulnerability, and resilience are central to public life in ways they have not always been, a film that places a female character in a scenario of extreme danger and allows her to survive entirely through her own capability rather than through male intervention or rescue is making a statement even when it is not trying to. Sasha does not wait for the park ranger to notice something is wrong. She does not hope for a helicopter. She does not look for someone to save her. She solves every problem herself, using everything she has, until the threat is eliminated. That is the kind of female agency that audiences in 2026 respond to with particular enthusiasm. The theme of grief and its cultural resonance. Apex is also, beneath its thriller surface, a film about grief, and specifically about the particular kind of guilt that comes from surviving something that killed the person you loved most. This is a theme with deep cultural and psychological roots. The experience of survivor's guilt is one that has been documented and discussed in psychological literature for decades, emerging most prominently in research on Holocaust survivors and later on veterans of combat, people who survived accidents that killed their companions, and families who lost members to illness or violence. The central emotional reality of Apex, which is that Sasha made a choice to survive at the cost of Tommy's life and cannot forgive herself for that choice, is one that a very large number of people in the audience will recognize in some form from their own experience of loss, even if the specific circumstances are entirely different. The film's structure uses the survival thriller genre as a vehicle for psychological healing. Sasha does not go to Australia to do therapy. She goes to push herself into danger because danger is the only thing that distracts her from the grief she cannot process through conventional means. What she encounters there forces her to confront, in the most literal and physical possible way, the question of whether she deserves to survive. Ben explicitly needles her about Tommy's death when he has her in his power, using it as a psychological weapon, trying to break her will by activating the guilt she already carries. The film's emotional climax, when she finally speaks about Tommy in the dark while tied to the man who has been trying to kill her, is the moment when the grief stops being a wound she is protecting and becomes something she can actually look at. That transformation is what gives her the capacity to win the final confrontation. Director Kormákur explicitly described her journey as a self-inflicted reckoning, and the film's final image of her throwing Tommy's compass into the ocean is the culmination of a grief arc that is, at its heart, a very human story dressed in the costume of an action thriller. The cannibalism element, and its cultural history. The revelation that Ben is a cannibal who processes his victims into beef jerky is one of the most viscerally disturbing elements of Apex, and it connects the film to a long cultural history of cannibalism as a signifier of the absolute outer limit of human transgression. Cannibalism occupies a unique place in the human moral imagination precisely because it violates the boundary between the self and the other in the most radical and irreversible way possible. To consume a human being is to treat personhood as a resource, to reduce a person who had relationships and feelings and history to raw material. It is the ultimate denial of another person's humanity. In film and literary culture, cannibalism has been used repeatedly as a device to signal the complete collapse of the social contract and the boundary between human civilization and something more primal and terrifying. The Silence of the Lambs, the 1991 film that won all 5 major Academy Awards and remains one of the most culturally influential thrillers ever made, built its iconic villain Hannibal Lecter almost entirely around his cannibalism and the terrifying combination of extraordinary refinement with the willingness to consume other human beings. The film Alive, mentioned earlier, dealt with the desperate cannibalism of plane crash survivors as a genuine and morally complex human experience rather than a horror device. The television series Hannibal, which ran from 2013 to 2015, spent 3 seasons exploring the aesthetics and psychology of a cannibal who frames his predation as a form of connoisseurship. The Road, Cormac McCarthy's novel and the subsequent film adaptation, features roaming bands of cannibals as the ultimate symbol of a world that has lost all moral framework. In Apex, Ben's cannibalism is framed specifically as ritual rather than hunger. He does not eat people because he has no other food. He eats people because he has constructed an elaborate belief system in which consuming a worthy opponent keeps that person's spirit alive within him. This is a particular kind of cannibalistic logic that has appeared in anthropological accounts of various ritual practices across human history, though the specific details in the film are invented rather than drawn from any specific real tradition. Ben's revelation that his first victim was his own mother, whom he consumed to keep her close to him forever, transforms his cannibalism from something merely horrifying into something also psychologically complex and disturbing in a way that is very specifically about attachment, loss, and the refusal to accept death, which mirrors Sasha's own relationship with grief over Tommy. The film draws a dark parallel between the woman who cannot let go of the man she loves and the man who literally consumes those he does not want to lose, and that parallel gives the horror a thematic dimension that elevates it beyond pure shock value. The Icelandic director and the global survival genre. Baltasar Kormákur bringing his Icelandic sensibility to the Australian landscape for a film featuring a South African-American actress, a Welsh actor, and an Australian actor, all working together in the middle of the New South Wales wilderness, is itself a culturally interesting phenomenon that reflects the genuinely globalized nature of the streaming era of filmmaking. Netflix's model allows it to commission films from directors and stars across national boundaries without being constrained by the traditional logic of national film industries, and the result is a kind of internationalized cinema that would have been very difficult to finance and distribute through any previous model. Kormákur comes from Iceland, a country with a population of roughly 400,000 people and one of the most extreme natural environments on Earth. Icelanders live with volcanic activity, extreme cold, vast uninhabited spaces, and a landscape that is simultaneously breathtaking and actively hostile to human habitation. That background gives Kormákur a particular instinctive understanding of what it means for a human being to exist in genuine relationship with a natural environment that does not care about them, and it is a sensibility that has run through all of his most significant work. When he films the Blue Mountains of Australia, he is bringing the eye of someone who has spent his whole life in a landscape of comparable severity and grandeur, and the result is a film in which the Australian wilderness feels genuinely dangerous rather than merely picturesque. The global success of Apex, debuting at number 1 in Netflix's worldwide charts with over 38 million views in its first week, is itself a cultural data point worth noting. The survival thriller is one of the most universally legible genres in global cinema precisely because it strips storytelling down to its most fundamental elements. You do not need a deep familiarity with any specific culture to understand what it means for a human being to be hunted in a wilderness. The stakes are primal. The emotions are primal. The questions the genre asks, about what a person is made of, what they are willing to do to survive, and what they carry with them into the darkness, are questions that translate across every language and every cultural context. That is why a story first told by an American writer in a magazine in 1924 is still being retold in new and compelling forms in 2026, and why a film directed by an Icelander, starring a South African, a Welshman, and an Australian, shot in the wilderness of New South Wales, became one of the most watched films on Earth in the week it was released.